There's a particular kind of clarity that comes to a man when he stops waiting for things to get better and starts deciding what he is going to do about the fact that they won't. It doesn't arrive loudly. It doesn't arrive with a speech or a confrontation or a slammed door. It arrives the way most important things arrive in a man's life. Quietly, in the middle of something ordinary, while he's doing the dishes or driving to the hardware store or sitting on his back porch watching the light change over the neighbor's fence. It arrives like a decision that's already been made. You just hadn't written it down yet. My name is Henry Caldwell. I am 63 years old. I was a general contractor for 31 years. Residential builds, mostly, with some light commercial work in my 40s when the economy was moving and people wanted things built fast. I built houses, not metaphorically. I built houses with my hands and my crew and my name on the permit, and I understood better than most people that the difference between a structure that holds and a structure that fails is not dramatic. It is not a collapse you see coming from a mile away. It is a matter of whether the right person was paying attention at the right moment and whether they had the right documents on file when the moment came. My son Daniel is 41 years old. He manages regional accounts for a building supply distributor. Good company, reasonable salary, the kind of position that requires a man to be organized and persuasive and understand that the people he's selling to know more about the product than he does. He is good at it. He makes lists. He showed up to my retirement party 5 years ago with professionally printed poster boards summarizing my career highlights in bullet points, and I appreciated the gesture even though he'd gotten 2 of the years wrong and hadn't noticed. I want you to understand something about Daniel before I tell you what happened, because I am not in the business of making my son into something he isn't for the sake of a cleaner story. He is not a bad man. He has never been a bad man. He is a man who confused concern for himself with concern for me, and he did it so gradually and so completely that I genuinely think, he stopped being able to distinguish between the two. He would have told you, if you'd asked him directly, that everything he did was for my benefit. He would have believed that when he said it. That is not malice. That is something quieter and, in its own way, harder to address. Welcome to Quiet House Stories. Get comfortable and remember the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed. Trust me, you're going to love it here. The family meeting happened on a Sunday in late February. Daniel had called it. He used that phrase, called a family meeting, in a text message he sent me on a Thursday evening, and I read it standing at the kitchen counter and then set my phone face down next to the copper kettle on the stove and stood there for a moment looking out the window at the backyard. The neighbor's oak tree was bare. The rose bushes along the back fence had been pruned back in November and were nothing but sticks at that point. It was a kind of February afternoon that is honest about what it is. Daniel's wife, Claire, was going to be there. My daughter-in-law. 5 years into a marriage to my son that I had watched with the careful attention of a man who builds things for a living and knows that the integrity of any structure is only as good as its weakest joint. Claire is efficient. She manages accounts receivable for a medical billing company, and she approaches most situations in her life the way she approaches a spreadsheet, with the assumption that there is a correct answer and that her job is to locate it. I do not dislike Claire. I have never disliked Claire. I have simply understood, for most of the 5 years she's been married to my son, that when Claire is in the room, somebody has an agenda, and it is usually hers. They arrived at 2 p.m. on the dot. I had made coffee and put a plate of shortbread on the table, which Carol used to do when people came over, and which I have continued to do in the 8 years since I lost her, because some habits are the last place a person lives. Claire was carrying a small binder, dark blue, 3 rings, labeled tabs visible through the cover. That was the first detail that told me something specific about how the afternoon was going to go. Daniel sat across from me at the kitchen table and placed his hands flat on the surface, both of them, the way he does when he has prepared something, and wants you to register that he has prepared it. He is a good presenter. He can make a case. He learned that from Carol, who was a high school debate coach for 11 years before she switched to administration, and I have always been proud of him for it, even when the case he's making is one I'm not going to accept. He said they wanted to talk about the surgery. My hip replacement was scheduled for March 14th. 6 weeks out at that point. He walked through the recovery timeline as he understood it, which was reasonably accurate. He mentioned that the first 2 to 4 weeks would be difficult, that I would be on restricted mobility, that there would be a period of dependency on others for basic logistics. He said that as my only child, he felt a genuine responsibility to make sure the right protections were in place during that window. I told him I was having a hip replacement, not a lobotomy. He smiled at that. It was a real smile. He has his mother's smile, and I notice it every time. Claire did not smile. She opened the binder to the first tab section. He said the word financial twice in the next 90 seconds, which is a word that sounds like concern when someone says it slowly enough, and sometimes it's concern, and sometimes it's something else dressed in concern's clothing. He explained that they consulted with a few people. He said a few people without naming them, which is a detail worth noting, and that the responsible, protective, sensible step was for me to execute a durable financial power of attorney naming Daniel as my agent for the period surrounding the surgery and recovery. Claire slid a printed template across the table. It had highlighted lines where I would sign. For your protection, Daniel said. I want you to take a full moment with that phrase. For your protection. There's a version of it that is a son's genuine love, the kind that gets awkward in its expression and goes too far because it doesn't know how to stop. And there's a version of it that is a lock being turned on a door that belongs to you, from the outside, by someone who has decided you are no longer the right person to hold the key. The difference between those two versions is not in the words themselves. It is in the binder. It is in the highlighted lines. It is in the fact that Claire had already opened to the signature page before I had said a single word in response. I waited until Daniel finished. He had more to say, a mention of my contractor's pension, a comment about the savings accounts, a suggestion that the rental property on Birchwood Lane might benefit from having someone with power of attorney to manage any issues that came up during my recovery. I let him say all of it. I poured myself more coffee while he talked. I have been letting Daniel say all of it for 41 years, and it has been, on balance, among the most informative things I have ever done. Then I told him I had already signed one, in January, with someone else. The silence lasted 12 seconds. I counted them against the microwave clock on the counter behind him. Claire looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at me. The refrigerator hummed somewhere behind it all. Outside on Elmwood Court, a car went past slowly, and then it was quiet again. Some men spend their whole lives trying to be the loudest voice in the room. I have never been that man. I don't make speeches. I don't slam doors. I don't need the last word, and I have never confused volume with authority. I have been a man at the kitchen table who pours the coffee and listens and waits. And if you've spent years looking at that man and concluding that his patience was passivity, that his quiet was emptiness, that his willingness to let you finish was permission, that was a conclusion you reached on your own. I did not put it there. Let me tell you how I got to January. My wife, Carol, had a saying. She repeated it the way practical people repeat the things that have actually held up for them over time, which is to say often enough that you stop hearing it, and then, at a specific moment in your life when you need it, you hear it again like it's the first time. The time to fix the roof is when the sun is shining. Carol died 8 years ago. Ovarian cancer. We had 14 months between the diagnosis and the end of it, and in those 14 months, I was present for every appointment, every conversation, every decision, because that was my job, and I have never in my life walked away from a job that needed doing. When she was gone, I went through the grief the way a man goes through hard labor, one day at a time, no shortcuts, with the understanding that the only way out is through. Daniel was attentive in the years after. Genuinely attentive. For a while. He called twice a week. He and Claire came for Sunday dinners in the first year. He sat at the same kitchen table and told me stories about work, and asked about the house, and took care of things around the yard that he knew I was behind on. I was grateful for that. I want to say that plainly because it is true, and because the rest of the story is only honest if I acknowledge where it started. But somewhere in the 3rd year after Carol's death, I could not tell you the exact date, only the season, which was autumn, something in the pattern of Daniel's attention shifted. The questions changed, not dramatically, not all at once. But I noticed the way I notice when a load-bearing wall has developed a sound it didn't use to make, that the questions were becoming less about how I was doing and more about what I had. He asked about the pension structure. He asked about the savings accounts, how they were organized, whether I'd updated the beneficiary designation since Carol passed, whether I'd thought about consolidating. He asked about Birchwood Lane, whether the rental income was worth the management headache at my age, whether I'd thought about liquidating the property. He asked the way that people ask when they're genuinely interested. I gave him the benefit of the doubt the way that fathers give sons the benefit of the doubt, which is longer than they probably should. It was Danny Kowalski who changed how I listened. Danny owns Kowalski's Auto on Flatbush Street, 7 minutes from my house. We've been friends for 32 years. Our boys played Little League together, and our friendship outlasted Little League the way the good ones do, becoming something quieter and more permanent over time. He threw in wiper blades at my last service without charging me, because he said I'd been coming in long enough to have earned them. We had coffee at the diner on a Wednesday morning in October, the October after I retired, and I mentioned that Daniel had been asking questions again about the contractor's pension and whether I looked into putting it in a trust. Danny set down his coffee mug. He is not a complicated man, which is one of the things I have always valued about him. He said, "Henry, does Daniel need money?" I said I didn't know. He said, "That's interesting, because you should." I drove home through the October afternoon. I pulled into the driveway and turned off the F-150 and sat there with the engine ticking down in the quiet. I'd had the radio on. An old Johnny Cash station. They still broadcast out of the tower on Route 9, and I clicked it off before I pulled it out of habit. The neighborhood was still. The Anderson oak across the street was dropping leaves in the slow, steady way it has for the 22 years I've lived on this block. I could see my own front walk from where I was sitting, and the rose bushes Carol planted in 1998 that I've kept up every year since. I sat there with my coffee mug from the cup holder, the white ceramic one with the faded Myrtle Beach logo, the one Carol bought in the summer. We drove south with 12-year-old Daniel in the back seat, asking every 40 minutes whether we were close. And I thought about Danny's question. I thought about it carefully. I thought about the shift I'd noticed in Daniel's attention, the way questions about my welfare had slowly become questions about my assets, the way he had started speaking about my life as a set of problems he was positioned to resolve. I thought about Carol saying, "The time to fix the roof is when the sun is shining." My hip had been bothering me since the spring. The orthopedist had told me in July that the replacement was coming, that it was a matter of when rather than whether. I had scheduled the surgery for March. And I understood, sitting in the driveway of the house I'd paid off in 2007, holding a coffee mug from a beach trip 16 years ago, that a scheduled surgery was not the sun shining. It was the clouds building. And the people who wait for the clouds to arrive before they fix the roof are the people who end up sitting in the rain, wondering how it got inside. I made a decision in that driveway. It was quiet and clean and total, the way the best decisions are. I was going to get my documents in order before my son could do it for me. Beverly Holt has practiced elder law and estate planning for 23 years. Her office is on Providence Road in a modest brick building between a title company and a pediatric dentist, which I have always thought was an accidental but appropriate arrangement. The beginning of life and the management of its end, 12 feet apart in the same strip of office space. Beverly has a calm face and a methodical intelligence, and she does not dramatize. She treats every client situation with the same even professional attention, which is exactly what you want when the situation is your own. I called her on a Monday morning in early November and told her I needed to accomplish 3 things. First, I wanted to review and update my will, which had last been touched 7 years ago and still named Carol as primary beneficiary on several instruments. Second, I wanted to correct the beneficiary designations on my retirement accounts, which had the same problem. Third, and most specifically, I wanted to execute a durable financial power of attorney naming someone I trusted as my agent. Someone other than my son. Beverly asked her questions. She is good at asking questions that are precise without being intrusive, that let her understand the shape of the situation without requiring you to explain more of it than is necessary. When I was done, she told me she could see me the following Tuesday at 9:03 in the morning. I arrived at 8:59, 1 minute early. Old habit. The person I named as my financial power of attorney agent was my brother Dennis. Dennis is 68 years old. He spent 22 years as a United States Army engineer and retired as a lieutenant colonel. He lives in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, 4 hours away. He is the most straightforward person I have known in my entire life, which is not a common thing to be able to say about a family member and which I do not take for granted. When I called him in November to ask if he'd be willing to take on the role, he said, "About time, Henry." He asked 2 clarifying questions about his responsibilities, listened to the answers, and said he'd be available for Beverly's office to contact him. That was the full extent of the conversation. Beverly notarized a durable financial power of attorney on January 14th, a Tuesday at 9:03 a.m. She filed the appropriate notifications. She kept a copy in her client files. I kept a copy in the green file folder in the second drawer of my home office desk, behind the lease agreement for the Birchwood Lane rental and in front of the paid-off mortgage documents for this house. I put a rubber band around it. I filed it and went home and made dinner. I did not tell Daniel. There was no malice in that. I did not keep it from him to wound him or surprise him or set a trap. I kept it from him because it was my document, signed with my name, executed by my attorney, reflecting my decision about my own life. I had not abdicated the management of my affairs. That job had never been posted. Daniel had simply been conducting himself as though he'd already been hired for it. Back at the kitchen table on that Sunday in February, after I told him what I'd done and when and with whom, Daniel asked who I had named. I said Dennis. He said Uncle Dennis was in Pennsylvania. I said Pennsylvania had phones, and that Dennis had a car, and that Beverly Holt's office was 12 minutes from this house. If anything came up that required a physical presence. He was quiet for another moment. Claire was looking at the binder. The binder was looking at the table. Daniel said this felt like a statement about trust. He said he felt like I was communicating something to him, that I was telling him he had done something wrong, without saying what. I told him that was a reasonable interpretation. He asked if it was accurate. I said, "Daniel, you brought a binder to a conversation about my health." He looked at Claire. I looked at my coffee. The afternoon light was coming to the window at the angle it does in late February, pale and low, the kind of light that doesn't apologize for what it shows you. There's a way of being honest with a person that doesn't require you to say every true thing out loud. The binder had said what it said. The January document had said what it said. What I said next was not a speech. It was 3 sentences, and then I let him think. I told him I was not angry. I told him I thought he needed to spend some time considering the difference between worrying about me and worrying about what was mine. I told him those were not the same thing, and that I thought somewhere along the way he had lost track of which one he was actually doing. He didn't answer right away. That was the right response. Some things deserve sitting with. I want to spend some time on Daniel now, because I think he deserved the attempt at understanding, and because the story is incomplete without it. My son grew up watching me work. He watched me come home with concrete dust on my jeans and sawdust in my hair, and put dinner on the table after his mother's second job ended at 6. He watched me work through 2 recessions and a roofing crew that walked off a job site in 2004, and a lawsuit from a client in 2009 that cost me 14 months and $23,000, and which I won, eventually on the strength of my documentation. He watched all of that, and I think, I have thought about this more than I have discussed it with anyone, that he drew the wrong conclusion from it. I think Daniel looked at 31 years of man with concrete dust on his pants and concluded that I had wanted something different and settled for this, that I was the version of a person who hadn't quite made it to wherever he was supposed to end up. And if I was a man who had settled, then I was a man who might not have the judgment to protect what little he had. And if I was a man without judgment, then someone who did have judgment, someone organized and forward-thinking, someone with a blue binder and highlighted signature lines, should probably step in. He got all of that wrong. But I understand the architecture of how he got there, what he didn't see, because I am not a man who explains himself unless asked, and because he didn't know to ask, was that I had been paying attention the entire time, to everything, to the accounts and the documents and the lease agreements and the beneficiary designations and the vendor contracts and the insurance policies and the will. I had been paying attention to my own life with the same care I'd given to 31 years of other people's houses. I just did it quietly, which is the only way I know how to do anything that matters. Carol used to say that Daniel worried because he loved, and she was right, and I think the love is still there underneath all of it. What happened is that the love got mixed up with fear. Fear of loss, fear of being left without, and the fear started driving. That is not a monster's motivation. That is a very ordinary human one. The saddest ones usually are. Beverly Holt came to the house on a Thursday morning in early March, March 7th, at 10 a.m., for what I had told her would be a brief review of the executed documents before my surgery. I wanted everything confirmed and current. She brought her charcoal gray leather folder and a copy of the filed power of attorney, and we sat at the kitchen table with chamomile tea steeping on the counter. For minutes, the way I've always done it since Carol stopped being the one who made it, and we went through the documents together. Daniel arrived at 10:14. He comes by without calling sometimes. He has done this for years, and Carol thought it was warm and spontaneous, and I have thought of it progressively as something else. He came through the back door the way he always does and stopped in the kitchen doorway. He had his jacket still on, one hand still on the doorframe. He took in Beverly at the table, the folder open between us, the legal-size pages visible if not readable from where he stood. Beverly introduced herself before I had to. She said her name. She said she was my estate planning and elder law attorney. She said she was here for a scheduled document review. She said it the way someone states something that is completely factual and requires no elaboration, which it was and which it didn't. Daniel stood there for a moment. His eyes went from Beverly to the documents to me. I said, "You want some tea?" He said he'd call me later. He said it quietly and he left the way he came in. I heard his car in the driveway, and then the street, and then nothing. Beverly waited a full minute after the sound of his car disappeared. Then she looked at me over her reading glasses. She wears them low on her nose when she's reviewing documents and pushes them up when she's talking to you, and said, "He seems like a person who doesn't often find himself in a room where decisions have already been made without him." I said that was about right. She said the documents were in order. She said Dennis had called her office the previous week to confirm his contact details, which I had asked him to do. She closed the leather folder and told me to have the hospital call her office directly if there were any questions about the power of attorney during the admission process. She walked out at 11:03. I watched her car go down Elmwood Court, and then I stood on the front walk for a moment in the pale March air, looking at the bare rose bushes along the fence. Carol planted them in 1998. I've kept them every year since. They were nothing but sticks in March, the way they always are, but I pruned them right in November, and I could see already the shape of what they were going to be. The surgery was on March 14th at 7:30 in the morning. I was in and out of Mercy General in 2 days. Dennis drove down from Harrisburg on the 13th and stayed in the guest room. He brought a bag and a book and asked very few questions, which is his way. On the morning I was discharged, he was waiting at the curb in his truck with a coffee from the shop across the street, and I came out through the sliding doors in the blue coat I'd packed in my bag, and I felt, if not exactly well, then at least exactly like myself. He said, "How do you feel?" I said I felt like I'd had a titanium component installed in my hip joint, which was accurate. He laughed. We drove home between March 14th and March 18th. There were 11 missed calls from Daniel on my phone and 3 voicemails. The first voicemail was about the surgery. Was I out? Was I okay? Let him know. The second was asking whether Dennis was still at the house and whether I needed anything. The third, left on March 17th at 6:42 in the evening, was quieter than the others. He said he'd been doing some thinking. He said he'd like to talk when I was up to it. I called him back on March 19th, a Wednesday, at 2:30 in the afternoon. I was in the recliner, in the living room with my leg elevated on a throw pillow and the white ceramic Myrtle Beach mug on the side table next to me, half full of coffee that had gone lukewarm. Dennis had gone back to Harrisburg the day before. The house was quiet in the way it gets when recovery is going well, and there's nothing left to manage. Daniel answered on the first ring. He said he wanted to apologize. He had given it thought. He said he'd talked to Claire. He understood that the family meeting had not been what he told himself it was. He said he was sorry for the binder. I told him the binder wasn't the core of it. He asked what the core of it was. I said, "Daniel, somewhere in the last few years you stopped asking how I was doing and started asking what I had. I don't think you noticed when that happened. I don't think I'm entirely wrong that you still haven't fully noticed it. That's what I'd like you to sit with." He was quiet. I let him be quiet. I have always been better at silence than my son, and I have stopped apologizing for that. He said that wasn't how he experienced it. I said I believed him. I said our experience of something and the truth of it can occupy the same moment without being the same thing. We talked for 22 more minutes. I am not going to tell you it resolved into something clean, because it didn't. And I think a man who tells a story and wraps it too neatly is a man who is more interested in the story than the truth. Daniel said things that were honest and some that were defensive in about equal measure. I said things that were patient and some that were harder than patient in about equal measure. We hung up without a plan. He said he'd like to come over when I was moving around better. I told him I'd let him know. There's a cost to all of this that doesn't appear on Beverly Holt's invoice. Her fee was $1,847. Fair for 23 years of experience and documents that will hold up in any court in this state. That is not the cost I'm talking about. The cost I'm talking about is sitting in the recliner on a Wednesday afternoon in March, after 22 minutes on the phone with your son, with a lukewarm coffee in a quiet house, and knowing that you were right about something, and that being right about it did not make it feel good. It made it feel necessary. Those are different things. I have been in this house for 26 years. Carol is in every room of it still, in the ways that matter. The copper kettle on the stove, the chamomile tea, the rose bushes she chose from a nursery catalog in the spring of 1997 because she liked the name of the variety and the color in the photograph. I kept all of it. I will keep all of it. It is late August now. The hip is good. I walk 2 miles every morning on the route Carol and I used to do together, down Elmwood and left on Sycamore and back along Park. And I do not rush it. Dennis calls on Sunday evenings. Beverly's office sent a reminder that my 5-year review comes up in November. Daniel came for dinner on a Tuesday in July. Just him. No Claire, no binder. He texted the day before to ask if he could come, which was different, and I told him yes. We ate on the back porch. Pot roast and cornbread, Carol's way, which takes most an afternoon, and is worth every minute of it. And we talk about his job, and the Birchwood rental, and a little about his mother, which we don't do easily, but which we both needed more than we'd said. At some point in the evening, he asked how Dennis was doing. I said Dennis was fine. He nodded. He didn't say anything else about it, and neither did I. He didn't ask about the accounts. I noticed that, and I filed it the way I file things that matter, quietly, without comment, in the right drawer. Some men would call what happened here victory. I don't have much use for that framing. I signed a document, and my son walked into a room and found out that the decision had been made without him, and that is a fact, and it was the right fact to establish. But there's a version of your son that existed before all of this, the one who showed up to your retirement party with a poster board and got 2 of the years wrong. And that version is still in there somewhere, and the distance between that version and the one who sat across from me with a blue binder is a distance I had some part in creating, even if I could not have told you exactly when or exactly how. That is not a comfortable thing to sit with. I sit with it anyway. That is the only honest response to it. The rose bushes are doing well this year. Red, full, the best they looked in 3 or 4 summers. I deadhead them on Thursday mornings, the way Carol taught me, and by Friday they've already started coming back. There is something in that I do not feel the need to name. Some things are better left as what they are. If you enjoyed this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of Quiet House Stories. I will see you on the next one.